is an island in San Francisco Bay that sits like a gray fist in cold water. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The island is called Alcatraz. You have probably heard the name. Most people have. It floats about 1.25 miles off the shore of San Francisco, close enough that on a clear day you can see the city lights from the cell block windows. Close enough to feel like freedom was right there. Close enough to be cruel. The water between that island and the mainland is some of the coldest, roughest water on the West Coast. The currents run fast and strange. The bay looks calm from a distance, the way a sleeping animal looks calm. But underneath, the water moves in ways that pull and twist and do not let go. The temperature hovers around 50 degrees, even in summer. 50 degrees does not sound like much, but 50 degrees will stop a man's muscles inside of 30 minutes. It will pull the warmth right out of him like smoke from an open window. The federal government knew all of this when they chose the island. That was the point. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary opened in 1934. It was built to hold the men the other prisons could not handle. The escape artists, the troublemakers, the ones who kept trying. The thinking behind it was simple. Put them somewhere the water itself becomes the wall. Let the bay do what concrete and steel cannot. And for 29 years, that plan worked. Dozens of men tried to escape. Some were caught on the rocks. Some were shot. Some were pulled from the water half dead. And some simply vanished into the bay and were never seen again, which the government counted as a kind of success. Nobody made it. That was the official record. Nobody ever escaped from Alcatraz and survived. Then came the night of June 11th, 1962. 3 men went into the dark water of San Francisco Bay and were never found. Not alive, not dead. Their names were Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. They were federal prisoners. They were also, by any measure, extraordinary men. And what they did that night has never been fully explained. The official story says they drowned. The currents took them. The cold took them. The bay swallowed them the way it had swallowed every other man who tried. The FBI closed the case in 1979, 17 years later, and called it a presumed drowning. 3 men presumed dead, case closed. But here is the thing about that word. Presumed. It means we think so. It means probably. It means we looked and we did not find them. So we drew a conclusion and wrote it down and hoped nobody asked too many questions. Presumed is not the same as certain. Presumed is the word you use when the evidence runs out and you still need an answer. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed sightings. No graves. Just 3 men who walked into the night and became a question the government has been answering the same way for 60 years. And yet the story keeps coming back. It comes back in letters and photographs and old men with familiar faces. It comes back in the testimony of people who say they knew something, saw something, heard something. It comes back because the human mind knows the difference between a story that is finished and a story that is only pretending to be. This one is pretending. Alcatraz closed in 1963, just 1 year after the escape. Today it is a national park. Tourists walk the cell block in the morning fog, their voices echoing off the old concrete. They peer into the cells. They stand at the windows and look out at the bay, at the gray-green water moving below, at the city shining in the distance. They take photographs. They buy postcards. And sometimes a ranger tells them about the night of June 11th, 1962, and the 3 men who vanished. The tourists nod. They find it interesting. They move on. But some stories do not let you move on so easily. Some stories follow you home. They sit with you in the quiet hours when the lights are low and the world has gone soft around the edges. They ask you to consider the impossible. They ask you to wonder. This is one of those stories, and it starts with a spoon. The year was 1962. Let that settle for a moment. Dwight Eisenhower had just handed the White House to John Kennedy. The country was young and loud and full of itself. Cars were long and chrome-heavy, with fins like sharks. Men wore hats to work. Women pinned their hair up tight. The television was still a novelty in some houses. The Cold War hummed in the background of everything, low and constant, like a refrigerator left running in an empty room. San Francisco in 1962 was a city caught between two worlds. The old world of sailors and longshoremen and fish markets still breathed along the waterfront. The new world of coffee shops and folk singers and restless young people was just beginning to stir. The city smelled like salt and diesel and sourdough bread. Cable cars groaned up the hills. Fog rolled in off the Pacific every evening, thick and white, swallowing the bridges and the rooftops and the church spires, until the whole city looked like something half remembered from a dream. And out in the bay, about 1.25 miles from the shore, sat the island, Alcatraz, the rock. 22 acres of sandstone and concrete rising out of cold water. The island was not beautiful exactly, but it had a kind of brutal presence. It sat there the way a fist sits on a table, deliberate, immovable. The buildings were painted a pale institutional yellow, the color of old teeth. The cell block ran the length of the island's spine, long and flat, and windowless from the outside. Seagulls nested on the rooftops. Cormorants dove in the water below the cliffs. The wind came off the bay in long, cold sheets, and it never really stopped. Inside, the prison ran on routine the way a clock runs on gears. Every movement was counted. Every meal was timed. The cells were 5 feet wide and 9 feet long. A man could take 3 steps in any direction and hit a wall. The walls were painted the same pale yellow as the outside, and they had the damp smell of concrete that has never quite dried out. There was a cot bolted to the wall, a toilet, a small shelf, a single bulb overhead. That was the world. That was all of it. The men who lived in those cells were not ordinary criminals. Alcatraz was not built for ordinary criminals. It was built for the ones who had escaped from other prisons, or tried to. The ones who had caused trouble, organized trouble, inspired trouble in other men. It was the last stop. The place the system sent you when it had run out of other ideas. And somewhere in that building, in the West Wing they called B Block, 3 men were being quietly forgotten. Frank Morris was 35 years old. He had been in and out of institutions since he was a child. Orphaned young, passed through the system like a stone through water, leaving barely a ripple. He had an IQ that the prison records put at 133. That is not a number the system knew what to do with. Smart men in small rooms tend to think too much. Frank Morris thought constantly. You could see it in his eyes, people said. A stillness there that was not peace. It was calculation. John Anglin was 32. His brother Clarence was 31. They were from a big farming family in Georgia. One of 13 children, raised in the fields and the heat and the red clay dust of the South. They had the look of men who had worked hard all their lives and gotten very little for it. Wide hands, quiet faces, the kind of men who do not talk much because they learned early that talking does not change anything. They had robbed banks together, been caught together, escaped from other prisons together. They were loyal to each other the way roots are loyal to the same tree. 3 men, 1 island, 1 mile of cold, dark water between them and the city lights. The system had looked at these 3 and decided they were contained, managed, filed away. It had looked at the concrete walls and the guard towers and the searchlights sweeping the water at night and decided that was enough. It had looked at the bay, at the currents that ran like cold rivers beneath the surface, at the water temperature that hovered around 50 degrees even in June, and decided that nature itself was the last lock on the door. The system was not afraid of Frank Morris. It was not afraid of the Anglin brothers. It had forgotten to be, and that forgetting, quiet and slow and completely ordinary, was the first mistake. Frank Morris was 35 years old when he arrived at Alcatraz. He was lean and pale, with dark eyes that moved slowly around a room before the rest of him did. He had a habit of watching exits, not in a nervous way, in a patient way, the way a man watches a door when he knows he has all the time in the world and intends to use every minute of it. He had been in and out of institutions since he was 13 years old. Reform schools first, then county jails, then federal prisons. The system had processed him so many times that his file was thick as a dictionary. But the file missed something. The file recorded what he had done. It never quite captured what he was capable of. Morris had an IQ of 133. That number sat in his records like a stone nobody picked up. Prison psychologists noted it. Administrators noted it. And then everyone moved on, because a smart man in a cell is still a man in a cell. Or so the thinking went. He read constantly. Not novels, not newspapers. He read engineering manuals, mechanical diagrams. He read the way some men pray, with full attention, with something close to devotion. His hands were always moving when he wasn't reading, folding things, bending things, taking small objects apart and putting them back together in ways that made more sense to him than they had before. The other inmates noticed. They gave him space, not out of fear, out of something more like respect, the kind you give a man who is clearly working on something you cannot see yet. John Anglin was 32. His brother Clarence was 31. They had grown up in a family of 13 children in a farmhouse in Georgia, and then later in Florida, following the crops north and south with the seasons. They had picked beans and tomatoes and oranges under a sun that did not forgive. They had slept in labor camps and roadside shacks and places that had no names. They had learned early that the world was not going to hand them anything, and so they had started taking what they needed. They were big men, not tall exactly, but wide, built like the work had built them, which it had. John had a scar along his left jaw from a fight nobody remembered the details of anymore. Clarence had a way of smiling that made you feel like you were in on something, even when you weren't sure what it was. They were easy to like. That was the thing about the Anglins that the official records never captured. They had warmth. They told stories. They remembered your name and the names of your people. In a place like Alcatraz, where men went months without a kind word, that warmth meant something. It moved through the cell block like heat from a small fire. The brothers had escaped from other prisons before, not just once, multiple times. They had walked out of a Florida prison by hiding in a bread truck. They had climbed a fence in the middle of the afternoon, in plain sight, and gotten 2 miles before anyone noticed. They were not reckless. patient. They waited for the right moment, the way farmers wait for the right weather. They had grown up watching the sky. They knew how to read conditions. When Morris and the Anglin brothers ended up in the same cell block at Alcatraz, something shifted. You could not have pointed to the moment. There was no meeting, no handshake, no agreement made out loud. It was slower than that. It was the way Morris started spending time near the Anglins at meals. The way Clarence started asking Morris questions about the walls, about the ventilation, about the spaces between things. The way John would listen with his arms folded and his eyes steady, nodding slowly, like a man confirming something he had already suspected. They were not friends the way people outside use that word. They were something older than that, something that does not have a clean name. They trusted each other with the thing that mattered most, which was their freedom. And that trust was built on years of shared history and shared failure, and the particular bond that forms between people who have survived the same hard weather. And so they began, quietly, without ceremony, the way all serious work begins. Morris had noticed something about the cells. The concrete around the ventilation grates at the back of each cell was old, older than the rest of the structure. It had been weakening for years, absorbing moisture from the bay air, losing its grip on itself the way old things do. And Morris had a spoon. The spoon was just the beginning. But before we get to what they built, we should spend a little time in the world they were trying to leave. Because that world had its own rhythm, its own sounds and smells and small rituals. And if you want to understand what these three men risked, you have to understand what a day on Alcatraz actually felt like from the inside. The morning count came first, always, before the light had fully settled over the bay, before the fog had lifted off the water. A guard would walk the cell block. His shoes made a particular sound on the floor, a flat, even click that echoed off the concrete and the iron bars and the high ceiling above. Every prisoner knew that sound the way you know the sound of your own front door. It meant the same thing every single morning. It meant, we know where you are. We are watching. You belong to us. The count happened 5 times a day, sometimes more. The guards would shine a flashlight into each cell. They were looking for a body in a bunk, a shape under a blanket, a face on a pillow. They were not looking hard because they never had to look hard. Alcatraz had never been escaped from, not successfully. The island itself was the security. The cold water, the distance, the current that ran through the strait like a slow, dark engine. The guards had grown comfortable, not careless exactly, but comfortable. And comfort is a kind of blindness. The cells were small, 6 feet wide, 9 feet deep, enough room to take 3 steps in any direction before you hit a wall. The walls were painted a pale, institutional green, the color of old hospitals and government waiting rooms. The paint had yellowed at the edges where moisture crept in from outside. The air smelled of salt and iron, and the particular staleness of a place where windows do not open. In the winter, the cold came through the concrete and settled into your bones like something permanent. The men ate together in the dining hall. Long tables, metal trays, the sound of hundreds of forks and spoons against metal plates. The food was, by most accounts, better than you might expect. The federal prison system believed that good food reduced violence. So the meals were real meals: meat and vegetables and bread. Coffee in the morning, thick and dark. The dining hall was one of the few places where the men could exist in something close to ordinary human company. They could talk quietly. They could watch each other. They could learn things. Morris and the Anglin brothers learned each other here. In the dining hall, in the yard, in the slow hours between counts, when the block settled into its particular silence, they learned each other's habits. The way Clarence laughed, the way John held his coffee cup with both hands, the way Morris went quiet when he was thinking hard about something, his eyes moving to some middle distance that only he could see. And all the while, in the back of each of their cells, the work was happening. The ventilation grates sat low on the back wall. They were covered with a painted metal grill, and behind the grill was a shaft that ran through the building. Morris had been right about the concrete around them. It was soft. It crumbled under pressure. A spoon worked patiently into the seam between the grate and the wall, could do real damage over time. Not fast, never fast, but time was the one thing they had in abundance. They worked at night. After the last count, when the block went dark, and the only light came from the distant glow of the city across the water, they would lie on their backs in their bunks and reach behind them and work. Slowly, quietly, the sound of a spoon against concrete is not loud, but it carries in a silent place. So they learned to time it, to work during the moments when other sounds covered them. A cough from down the block, the wind off the bay pressing against the building, the distant horn of a ship moving through the strait. And this is where the dummy heads come in. Because the work was slow and the work took months, and during those months, the morning count kept coming. That flat click of shoes on concrete, that flashlight beam sweeping through the cell, that guard looking for a shape in a bunk, a face on a pillow. They needed faces, so they made them. What they built with almost nothing is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the whole long story of American escape. And it started with soap and paint and hair collected from the barbershop floor. Soap is a strange thing to sculpt with. It is soft, and it crumbles, and it smells like the inside of a clean room, which was not something those cells smelled like. But soap holds a shape if you work it slowly. If you press your thumb into it with patience, if you understand that you are not making art, you are making a lie that only needs to last for 30 seconds in the dark. Frank Morris started with his hands, just his hands and a bar of soap, and whatever time the night gave him. He pressed and smoothed and carved. He built a nose first, because a nose is the thing a flashlight catches. A nose throws a shadow. A shadow in a bunk looks like a sleeping man. He worked by feel mostly, because the light was bad and he could not risk a lamp. His fingers learned the shape of a face, the way a blind man learns a room. The others watched, and then they did the same. John and Clarence Anglin had grown up poor in Georgia, picking crops in the flat, hot fields before they ever saw the inside of a cell. Their hands were used to careful work, used to doing one small thing over and over until it was right. They took to the sculpting quickly. They mixed soap with concrete dust to give the heads a harder skin. They used paint from the prison workshop, colors they had saved and traded for, to give the faces something close to flesh. A dull tan, a pale rose along the cheeks. The paint was not perfect. Nothing about this was perfect. But perfect was not the goal. Good enough was the goal. Good enough at 5 a.m. when a guard was tired and the light was dim and the face on the pillow was still. And then there was the hair. The barber shop at Alcatraz was a real place, a small room where men sat in a chair, and a prison barber cut their hair with clippers that hummed like a trapped insect. The hair fell to the floor. Someone swept it up. That was the routine. But before the sweeping, before the broom came through, the men collected what they could. Dark strands and light ones, coarse and fine. They pressed the hair into the tops of the soap heads and smoothed it down. It looked, in low light, like a man who had not combed his hair that morning, which was most of the men in that place. The finished heads were not beautiful. Up close in daylight, they would have fooled nobody. The features were rough. The skin color was uneven. The eyes were painted on, flat and dull, like the eyes on a doll left too long in the sun. But they were not meant to be seen up close in daylight. They were meant to be seen from a doorway, through iron bars, by a man with a flashlight who had already checked 40 other cells and had 40 more to go. And they worked. Every morning the count came, and every morning the guards moved through the block, and every morning the flashlight beams swept across the bunks and found shapes and faces and moved on. The guards saw what they expected to see. A man asleep, a head on a pillow, the slow rise and fall of a chest, which the men had also figured out. A system of blankets arranged just so. A shape that suggested breathing without requiring it. The count moved on. The block stayed quiet. And behind the false walls of those cells, the real work continued. Now here is the thing that stays with you when you sit with this story long enough. These men had nothing. They had spoons and soap and stolen paint and hair from a barbershop floor. They had the dark and the noise of the wind and the patience that only comes from having nowhere else to be. They had each other, communicating through a ventilation grate in whispers, so low they were almost not sound at all, almost just the shape of words pressed through the air. And of nothing, they built a plan that worked. Not just the heads, not just the tunnel behind the walls. Something else too. Something that the guards did not find and the FBI did not fully account for, and the official reports sort of skipped past without quite explaining. Something that was discovered only later, after the men were gone, in a corner of the utility corridor that ran behind the cells. A sound, or the evidence of one. A mark on the wall that nobody made. The night of June 11th, 1962 was cold. Not the kind of cold that bites. The kind that settles. The kind that comes off the water slow and steady, like the bay itself is breathing out. San Francisco sat across that water, lit up and warm, close enough to see, but far enough to feel like another world entirely. Out on the island, the fog had come in thick. It moved like something alive, rolling over the rocks and up the walls of the prison, softening every edge, muffling every sound. Old-timers who lived along the waterfront back then will tell you that kind of fog has a weight to it. You can feel it on your skin. It presses down on your shoulders like a hand. The fishermen who worked those waters knew the bay's moods better than anyone. They knew the tides. They knew the currents. They knew which stretches of water looked calm, but would pull you sideways before you understood what was happening. And they knew that on a night like that one, the bay was not a place you entered without a plan. Some of them were out that night. Not many. A few small boats running late, heading back toward the docks at Sausalito and Tiburon. One man, an older fellow who had fished those waters since before the war, said he saw something. He never went to the authorities with it. He told his daughter, who told her son, who eventually told a reporter decades later. What the old fisherman said he saw was this: 3 shapes in the water, moving together, staying low, not swimming exactly, more like drifting, moving with the current rather than against it. He watched them for a moment, and then the fog closed back in, and they were gone. He didn't think much of it at the time. People went into the bay sometimes. Drunk men, desperate men. The bay kept most of what it took. He figured whatever he saw, the water would sort it out. He went home. He didn't mention it for years. At the diner near the fisherman's wharf, the story got passed around in pieces. A waitress who worked there in the early 60s remembered the morning after. She remembered the police boats. She remembered the way the officers moved, fast and tight-lipped. The way people move when something has gone wrong, and they are not yet sure how wrong. She said the regulars at the counter were already talking by the time she poured the first cup of coffee. Word travels fast in a waterfront town. The stories that got traded in those first hours were the kind that grow in the telling. Some people said the men had drowned for certain, that nobody could survive that crossing. Others said they had seen a raft pulled up on the Marin shore weeks before, abandoned, waterlogged, like someone had left it there in a hurry. Nobody could say exactly where. Nobody could say exactly when. But the story stuck around. There is an old belief among the people who have lived along that bay for generations. They say the water has a way of deciding, not in a cruel way, more like a judge. The bay takes what it wants and lets go of what it doesn't. The currents run in patterns that the fishermen have mapped in their heads over lifetimes. And those patterns, if you know them, if you have studied them the way a careful man might study a problem for months, can carry you somewhere, not just anywhere, somewhere specific. A retired harbor pilot, interviewed years later by a documentary crew, put it plainly. He said a man who knew the tides and left at the right hour could ride the current northwest without much effort at all. He said the water that night would have been moving in exactly the right direction. He said it like it was simple, like it was just math. The locals never really believed the official version. Not fully. People who live close to the water have a different relationship with what the water can do. They know it is not always a killer. Sometimes it is a door. And so the stories kept moving, the way stories do in small communities, from the diner to the bait shop to the church steps on Sunday morning, each person adding a detail. Each detail adding a little more weight to the idea that those 3 men had not drowned, that the bay had made its decision, that it had let them go. Nobody could prove it. Nobody could say for certain what the fog had hidden that night. But the feeling stayed. The feeling that something had passed through those waters and come out the other side. morning came slow to Alcatraz. It always did. The fog held on past sunrise, clinging to the rocks and the iron railings, and the cold concrete walls like it did not want to let go. The light that finally broke through was thin and gray, the color of old dishwater. Gulls moved through it. The bay sat flat and quiet. And somewhere on the island, a guard made his rounds. He walked the same path he walked every morning, past the same doors, past the same bars, his boots on the same floor. He had done it so many times that his body knew the route without his mind having to think about it. That is the thing about routine. It makes you comfortable, and comfort makes you slow. When he reached the cells of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, he called out the way he always did. He expected the usual sounds: a groan, a shift of weight, the small noises of men waking up in a place they could not leave. What he got was silence. He looked through the bars. The shapes in the beds looked right. The blankets were pulled up. The heads were visible on the pillows, turned just enough to look like sleeping men. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Then something made him look again. Some small wrongness that he could not name yet. He called out once more. Nothing moved. And then he knew. The heads were not heads. They were paper and paint and human hair, arranged with enough care to fool a tired man in bad light. The beds were empty. The men were gone. And the morning, which had seemed like every other morning, became something else entirely. The alarm that followed was loud and fast. Guards moved through corridors. Boats went out onto the water. Helicopters swept low over the bay. The whole machinery of the federal prison system lurched into motion. But the men they were looking for had been gone for hours. The fog had already swallowed whatever trail they left. The water had already done its work. What the guards found that morning was not just 3 empty cells. They found a story that the island had been building toward for a very long time, because Alcatraz had always been a place where things disappeared. Long before the federal prison opened its doors in 1934, the island had a different kind of reputation. The Ohlone people, who had lived along the shores of the bay for thousands of years, knew the island well. They called it a place apart. Some accounts suggest they avoided it, not out out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of respect. The island sat in the middle of the water, surrounded by current and cold, and it had its own rules. Things that went to the island did not always come back the same way. The Spanish saw it too, in their own way. They named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the island of the pelicans. They mapped it and noted it and mostly left it alone. It was useful as a landmark, as a place to mark on a chart, but it was not a place people rushed to settle. The rock was too hard. The wind was too constant. The fog came in too thick and stayed too long. The military claimed it next. They built fortifications there during the Civil War era, hauling in soil and timber and stone to make something livable on a surface that had never been meant for living. Soldiers were stationed there. Prisoners were kept there, military prisoners first, men who had broken the rules of a different kind of order. The island accepted all of them. It kept its silence. It gave nothing away. By the time the federal government turned it into a maximum security penitentiary, Alcatraz had already spent a century practicing the art of holding things in. Secrets, men, stories. The cold bay air had a way of preserving everything it touched. The stone walls had heard a great many things that never made it into any official report. So when those 3 men vanished in the summer of 1962, they were not the first things the island had swallowed. They were just the most famous. They were just the ones people kept asking about. The guards who searched the cells that morning were looking for evidence of an escape. What they were really standing inside was something much older, a place that had been keeping its own counsel since before anyone alive could remember. A place that had learned over a very long time how to hold a secret without ever letting it show. The rock knew how to wait. It had always known. The FBI arrived on the island before the fog had fully lifted. Agents in dark coats stepped off the boat and onto the dock, their shoes wet from the spray. They carried briefcases. They carried cameras. They carried the quiet confidence of men who believed they already knew what had happened. They just needed to find the proof. That proof, it turned out, was harder to locate than anyone expected. The official story came together quickly. Too quickly, some would later say. bureau announced that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had almost certainly drowned in the bay. The water was cold. The currents were brutal. No bodies had been found, but that was not unusual. The bay swallowed things and did not always give them back. The case was open, technically, but the tone of every press release made it clear that the government considered the matter settled. 3 men had gone into the water. 3 men had not come out. The end. A man named J. Edgar Hoover signed off on the investigation himself. But there was a reporter. There is always a reporter. His name was not famous then, and it is not famous now. But he worked for a small paper out of San Francisco, and he had a habit that served him well and cost him sleep in equal measure. He could not leave a loose thread alone. He pulled at things. He asked the question after the question had already been answered. He was the kind of man who wrote notes in the margins of official documents and then stared at those margins for a long time. He started making calls in the weeks after the escape. He talked to guards. He talked to dock workers. He talked to fishermen who had been out on the bay that night and had seen nothing, or said they had seen nothing, or were not entirely sure what they had seen. He filed records requests. He sat in waiting rooms. He drank bad coffee from paper cups and read through pages of FBI field reports that had been redacted so heavily they looked like crossword puzzles with no answers. What he found was not a smoking gun. It was something quieter than that. It was a series of small things that did not add up. The life preservers, for one. The men had built them from raincoats, stitching the material together with thread they had pulled from other garments. The FBI recovered pieces of those raincoats near the water's edge, but the pieces were oddly small, oddly few. If a raft had torn apart in the current, you would expect more. You would expect the bay to return the evidence the way it returned everything else. Driftwood, debris, the ordinary wreckage of things that did not survive. The paddle was another thing. A crude wooden paddle, hand-carved, was found floating near Angel Island. It was in good condition, not the condition of something that had been tumbling through rough water all night. More like something that had been set down gently and left to drift. The reporter things down. He underlined them. He drew small arrows in the margins, connecting one detail to another. Then there was the matter of the timing. The guards had made their rounds at midnight. The men were in their beds, or what appeared to be their beds. The papier-mâché heads, painted flesh-toned and topped with real human hair, had done their job. But the escape had required months of preparation, months of digging through concrete with spoons and nail clippers and improvised tools, months of building a raft and life preservers and a periscope from scraps. All of it done quietly. All of it done in secret. In a prison where men were watched constantly. The reporter sat with that for a while. He thought about what it meant. Not just that the men were clever, though they were, but that the prison, for all its reputation, had not seen it coming, had not heard it, had not noticed the growing pile of concrete dust that the men had been hiding in the vents. He wrote a piece. His editor cut most of it. What ran was 3 paragraphs on page 7, below a story about a city council vote. But the reporter kept his notes. He kept them in a folder in a filing cabinet in his apartment. He moved twice over the years, and the folder moved with him. He was not sure why he could not throw it away. He just knew that the official story had a feeling to it. The feeling of a door that had been closed too fast. The feeling of a room where someone had just been, where the air still held the shape of their presence, and you could almost catch it if you were quick enough, if you paid close enough attention. He was not quick enough, not then, but he kept the folder. Some people hold onto things they cannot explain, not because they want to, but because the thing will not let go of them. There was a fisherman. He worked the bay most of his life. He knew the water the way you know a person you have lived next to for years, its moods, its rhythms, the way it changed color before a storm. He was out before sunrise on the morning of June 12th, 1962. The fog was low and thick, sitting on the surface like a wool blanket pulled up to the chin of the world. He said the bay was quiet that morning, quieter than usual. He saw something in the water near Angel Island. He thought at first it was debris. A piece of wood, maybe. Something that had fallen off a boat. But then it moved. not the way debris moves, drifting with the current. It moved with intention. He said it was a shape, a dark shape, low in the water, moving slow and steady toward the northern shore. He watched it for a moment. Then the fog closed back in and it was gone. He did not think much of it that day. There were always strange things in the bay. The water kept its own secrets. But then he heard about the escape on the radio that evening, and something cold settled in his chest. He did not call the police. He was not sure what he would have said. He told his wife. He told his brother. He kept it to himself for 30 years before he told anyone else. There was a woman who lived in Marin County, just across the water from the island. She was young then. She remembered the night of June 11th because she had been sitting on her back porch late, watching the lights of the city across the bay. She said she heard something, not a sound she could name, more like a disturbance in the quiet. A soft splashing, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below the bluff behind her house. She leaned over the railing and looked down toward the water. She saw nothing. The dark was too complete, but she heard it for a long time before it faded. She said it did not frighten her. That was the thing she always came back to. It did not feel dangerous. It felt like effort, like something working very hard to get somewhere. She went inside and went to bed. In the morning, she heard the news. She stood in her kitchen with the radio on, and she thought about that sound. She thought about it for the rest of her life. There was a former Coast Guard officer who spent years studying the currents of San Francisco Bay. He was not a believer in the escape, not at first. He was a practical man. He dealt in tides and temperatures and the physics of moving water. He ran the numbers. The water that night was cold, around 50 degrees. The current near the island ran hard to the west, toward the Golden Gate. A man in the water without a wetsuit would lose feeling in his hands in about 10 minutes. His core temperature would start to drop not long after. The official position was that survival was unlikely, probably impossible. But the officer kept running the numbers. He factored in the raft. He factored in the life, preservers the men had made from the same raincoat material. He factored in the time of the tide, which that night was moving in a way that would have pushed a raft not out through the gate, but north, toward Marin. He factored in the fact that these were 3 men who had spent months preparing for exactly this. Men who were motivated in a way that changes what the body can do. He said the math did not rule it out. He said the math, done honestly, suggested it was possible. Maybe more than possible. He published his findings in a small journal. Nobody much noticed, but he stood by them. These are not dramatic people. They are not people who wanted attention. They are people who saw something, or heard something, or worked something out with pencil and paper, and found that what they knew did not match what they had been told. They carried that gap quietly. The way you carry something you are not sure what to do with. The way the reporter carried his folder through 2 apartments and 20 years. The water does not give up what it takes, but sometimes the people who live beside it remember things. Small things. Things that do not fit the story, and they hold on to them because somewhere in the weight of them, they sense the outline of something true. The morning after the escape, the bay was quiet. Fog sat low on the water, the kind of fog that makes the world feel smaller than it is. Fishermen were already out before sunrise, moving through the gray in their small boats, checking lines, watching the surface the way people who live by water always do. One of them found a paddle. It was floating near Angel Island, maybe 1.5 miles north of Alcatraz. A crude thing, rough cut, the kind of paddle you make when you have no tools and not much time. The wood was dark with water. The FBI collected it. They logged it. They said it was consistent with the materials the men had used. Then they moved on. But the fisherman remembered it. He told his son about it. His son told his own children. The paddle became part of the small, quiet folklore that grows up around events like this. Not the official story. The other one. The one that lives in kitchens and on docks and in the back corners of conversations that start with "my grandfather used to say." That paddle was not the only thing. In the weeks after the escape, other objects came ashore along the Marin County coastline. A piece of rubber that matched the material from the raft. A small bag. A sleeve from a prison-issued jacket. The FBI cataloged these things and offered explanations for each one. The raft had failed. The men had drowned. The objects were the last traces of 3 men the water had taken. That is one way to read it. Another way is this. If 3 men made it to shore, they would have ditched everything. The raft, the paddle, the jacket. You do not walk into a new life carrying the things that tie you to the old one. You leave them at the water's edge. You walk away from them the way you walk away from a fire you have just put out. Quickly, without looking back, the objects washed up in a pattern. Not all at once, not all in the same place, but along a rough line that pointed north, away from the city, toward the quieter parts of the coast where a man could move without being seen. Investigators who looked at the locations later noticed this. The scatter was not random. It had a direction to it. There is a stretch of coastline up near Point Reyes that is wild and empty even now. In 1962, it was wilder still. Tall grass, dark cliffs, the smell of salt and wet earth. A person could come ashore there in the dark and not be seen by anyone, could rest in the grass, could wait for morning, could figure out what to do next. Nobody knows if that is where they went. But the land up there does not give easy answers. It keeps things. The fog rolls in off the water most mornings and wraps the whole coast in something soft and white and private. It is the kind of place a person could disappear into if disappearing was what they needed. The objects kept coming up in conversation, not just the physical ones, the paddle and the rubber and the sleeve, but other things. Small details that different people noticed and held onto without knowing why. A guard who said the raft looked too well made for men who had never built one before. A diver who searched the bay floor and found nothing. Not a body, not a bone, not a scrap of the raft in the places where the current should have carried them. A woman who lived near the Marin shore who said she heard voices in the dark that night, 2 or 3 of them, moving through the brush behind her house, and then nothing. She did not call the police. She said later she did not know why. She just listened and then went back to sleep. And in the morning, she was not sure she had heard anything at all. These are the kinds of things that do not make it into official reports. They are too soft, too uncertain. They live in the space between what can be proven and and what people simply know in the way that people who pay attention to the world around them sometimes know things, but they rhyme with each other. That is the word for it. They rhyme. A paddle here, a voice there, a scatter of objects pointing north, a diver who found nothing where something should have been. Separate people, separate moments, separate years. And yet the same shape keeps appearing, like a word you keep hearing in different rooms, like something trying to be said. Now here is the part that takes a little sitting with. The FBI closed the Alcatraz escape case in 1979. 17 years after Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers went into the water, the Bureau decided they were dead. Drowned, gone, case closed. They handed what was left to the U.S. Marshals Service and walked away. That is the official version. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable. 17 years is a long time. The bay is cold. The current is brutal. 3 men on a raft made of raincoats had no business surviving that night. So the FBI called it. They moved on. But here is what sits underneath that decision, like a stone under still water. Closing the case meant something specific. It meant the FBI no longer had to look. It meant no more resources, no more agents, no more following leads that went nowhere or somewhere uncomfortable. It meant the story had an ending. And an ending, even a quiet one, is far easier to manage than a story that keeps going. Think about what it would mean if they were alive. 3 men escaped from the most famous prison in America. A prison that the Bureau of Prisons had spent decades calling inescapable. A prison that was the last stop, the end of the line, the place you sent men when every other place had failed to hold them. If Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin made it out alive, then the whole story of Alcatraz falls apart. The legend cracks. And more than the legend, the credibility of every agency that built that legend cracks with it. The FBI did not just have a professional interest in those men being dead. They had an institutional one. A living escapee is an embarrassment. A dead one is a cautionary tale. There is a difference between those two things. A big one. And so, when you look at the timeline of the investigation, something becomes clear. The moments when the case got close to something real. the leads that pointed toward living men. Those moments were followed very quickly by silence, by reassignment, by the conclusion that there was nothing there worth pursuing. In the late 1960s, federal investigators received information that the Anglins had been seen in Brazil. The tip was specific enough to take seriously. It named a location. It named people who had contact with them. Investigators looked at it. And then, quietly, they stopped looking at it. The reason given was that the information could not be verified. But unverified tips get followed up on all the time. That is what investigations are for. In the 1970s, there were reports of contact through family channels, letters that may have moved through intermediaries, photographs that may have shown familiar faces in unfamiliar places. None of it was ever confirmed, but none of it was ever truly disproven either. It was simply filed away in a place where filed away things go to become nothing. The Marshals' service, to their credit, never fully let go. They kept the case open. They kept following threads. They are still following them now, or were as recently as a few years ago. But the Marshals are not the FBI. They do not carry the same weight of institutional pride. They can afford to believe the men might be alive because they were never the ones who said Alcatraz was unbeatable. The FBI was. And that is the quiet engine running underneath all of this. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Not men in dark rooms deciding to hide the truth. Just the ordinary human machinery of an institution protecting its own story. The same thing that makes a person double down on a wrong answer rather than admit they were wrong. Scaled up, made official, stamped with a seal, and filed in triplicate. Frank Morris had an IQ that put him in the top fraction of 1% of the population. He had spent his whole life being underestimated by systems that thought they had him figured out. The Anglin brothers had been escaping things since they were boys running barefoot through the fields of Georgia. These were not men who made mistakes they did not plan for. The FBI needed them to be dead because the alternative was too costly to consider. But need is not the same as truth, and the water does not care what any agency decides. The bay keeps its own records. The current remembers where it carried things. And somewhere, in the long, quiet years after that June night in 1962, 3 men may have simply kept living. The question is where? And the answer, when it finally started to take shape, came from the most unexpected place. It came in the mail. That is the whole of it at first. A plain envelope, a letter inside, words on paper, the way people used to communicate before the world got faster and louder. And everyone forgot how to sit still long enough to write something down by hand. The letter arrived at a law office in 2013. That is the year most people heard about it. But the story the letter told reached back much further. It reached back to 1975. And then further still, to a night in June of 1962, when 3 men slipped into the black water of San Francisco Bay and were never seen again. The letter claimed to be from John Anglin, not a relative, not someone who knew him. John Anglin himself, one of the 2 brothers who had pressed their faces into homemade papier-mâché heads, tucked those heads under prison blankets, and crawled through a hole in the wall of the most secure prison in America. The letter said he was old. It said he was sick. It said he had been living in plain sight for decades, somewhere in the continental United States, and that he had watched the news and read the papers and seen the FBI say over and over again that he was dead, drowned, gone. A cautionary tale about what happens when men try to beat the system. He said the system was wrong. Now, you can hold that letter up to the light and look for reasons to doubt it. People write hoax letters all the time. People claim to be famous criminals. People want attention or money, or just the small thrill of watching investigators chase a ghost they invented. That is a real thing. It happens. But here is the detail that does not go away quietly. The letter contained information. Specific, private, verified information about the escape that had never been made public. Details that were not in any newspaper. Details that were not in any documentary. Details that lived only inside sealed FBI files and in the memories of the men who had been there. The FBI confirmed this, not loudly, not in a press conference with cameras and statements. Quietly, the way agencies confirm things they would rather not confirm. They said the letter was credible enough to reopen the investigation. They said it was worth taking seriously. Think about what that means. For 50 years, the official position had been that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the bay. Case closed. Files archived. The island moved on, became a tourist attraction, became a place where families take photographs in front of iron bars and try to imagine what it felt like to be locked inside. And then a letter arrives, and the FBI says quietly that maybe the case is not as closed as they thought. The letter made an offer. John Anglin, if the letter was truly from him, said he would turn himself in. He would come forward. He would answer every question. He asked for one thing in return: medical treatment. He said he had cancer. He said he was dying, and he did not want to die in a cell. He wanted to die somewhere with a window and a sky he could see. The FBI did not take the deal. They said they could not make that kind of arrangement. They said the law did not bend that way. And so, whatever thread connected that letter to a living man, if there was a living man, went quiet again. The offer sat on a table somewhere, and nobody picked it up. That is the detail that settles into you slowly. Not the letter itself, not even the private information it contained. It is the offer. A dying man, if he was dying, reaching out one last time. Not to brag, not to taunt, just to say, I am here. I have always been here, and I would like to stop running before the end. There is something very human in that. Something that does not feel like a hoax. Hoaxes are built for attention. They are loud and they want to be seen. This letter was quiet. It was tired. It had the weight of a very long time in it. 30 years of silence. Then a letter. Then silence again. The bay had kept its secret for 5 decades. And when the secret finally tried to speak, the machinery of the law looked at it, decided the terms were not acceptable, and let it go quiet once more. The water does not care about terms. The current just keeps moving. Some people will hear all of this and shake their heads. That is fair. That is reasonable. The skeptics have a case, and it is not a weak one. Their argument starts simple. The bay is cold. The current is is brutal. 3 men with no boat, no training, no real plan, paddled out into one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the Pacific coast, on a raft made of stolen raincoats. At night, in June, when the water temperature sits around 54 degrees. The skeptics say the math does not work. They say the men drowned. They say the FBI got it right the first time, and everything since has been people wanting a better story. And the skeptics are not wrong about the water. They are not wrong about the cold. 54 degrees will pull the heat from a human body faster than most people understand. You do not freeze slowly in water like that. You go numb. You lose your grip. You lose your sense of which way is up. The skeptics point to that and say, look, this is where the story ends. Right there in the dark water, a few hundred yards from shore. They point to something else too. No confirmed sighting. Ever. 3 men vanished off the face of the earth, and not one credible witness ever placed them somewhere specific, at a specific time, with a name attached. The letter from 2013 had no signature that could be verified. The photograph we are about to talk about has no caption, no date stamp anyone fully trusts, no chain of custody that satisfies everyone. The skeptics say that when the evidence is always just out of reach, always just a little too blurry, always just a little too convenient, that is not a mystery. That is a ghost story. They are not entirely wrong about that either. But here is where the skeptics go quiet. In 2012, a researcher working with the family of John Anglin came across an old photograph. It had been sitting in a box. Family photos, the kind that pile up in closets and get forgotten. The photograph showed 2 men. They were sitting outside somewhere warm. The light had that flat, bright quality you see in places far from the California coast. The men were older, much older than the Anglin brothers had been in 1962. Their faces were weathered and soft in the way that decades of outdoor living will make a face. They wore plain clothes. They were not looking at the camera straight on. The family looked at that photograph for a long time. They said those were their brothers. Now, the skeptics have answers for this. They say families see what they want to see. They say grief does strange things to memory. They They say two old men sitting outside in the sun could be anyone, anywhere. And the human brain is wired to find familiar faces in unfamiliar places. That is called pareidolia, and it is real, and it is powerful, and it has fooled people before. But then the photograph went to forensic analysts, people who do this for a living, people who measure the distance between eyes, the curve of an ear, the angle of a jaw. They compare those measurements against known photographs, the way a locksmith compares a key to a lock. And the analysts came back and said the measurements were consistent, not conclusive. Consistent. The ears matched. The jawline matched. The spacing of the features matched the Anglin brothers within the margin of what aging does to a human face over 50 years. Consistent is not proof. The skeptics are right to say that, but consistent is not nothing. The photograph was taken according to the best estimate anyone could put together sometime in the 1970s. In South America, two men who looked like the Anglin brothers, sitting in the sun, somewhere warm, somewhere far away, roughly a decade after they were supposed to have drowned in a cold black bay. The skeptics say it is coincidence. They say it is wishful thinking dressed up in scientific language. They say forensic facial analysis is not as reliable as television makes it look. And they are right about that too. But here is the thing about that photograph. The thing that makes even careful, skeptical people pause for just a moment. Nobody has been able to prove it is not them. In 50 years of looking, with all the tools the government has, with all the interest the case has drawn, nobody has put a name to those two faces that everyone agrees on. Nobody has found the two men in the photograph and said, "Here, these are ordinary people. This is who they were." The photograph just sits there, patient as the water, waiting for someone to explain it. There is a man named Ken Anglin. He is the nephew of John and Clarence, and for most of his adult life, he has done something that most people would call impossible. He has believed out loud in front of anyone who would listen that his uncles made it, not as a wish, not as a comfort. As a fact, he is willing to stake his name on. That takes something. That costs something. when you say your uncles escaped Alcatraz and lived, people look at you a certain way. They smile too carefully. They nod just a little too slow. The federal government has said for 60 years that those men drowned. The FBI has said it. The U.S. Marshals have said it. Textbooks say it. And you are standing there, a regular person with a regular life, saying no. You are saying you are wrong, all of you, and I can show you why. Ken Anglin kept going. He kept talking. He kept gathering what he could find. He was not alone. The Anglin family, spread across the warm, flat counties of Georgia and Florida, never fully accepted the official story. They held onto something quieter than certainty, but stronger than hope. They held onto the feeling that you get when you know someone, when you have sat at a table with a person and watched them eat and laugh and argue, when you have seen how they move through a room. That feeling does not dissolve just because a government agency sends you a letter. The family talked among themselves for years. They shared small things. A rumor heard from a cousin. A story passed down from someone who said they saw the boys years later, somewhere south. The details were never clean. They were the kind of details that folklore is made of. Soft at the edges, hard at the center. And then there was the funeral. In 1973, the mother of John and Clarence Anglin passed away. She was buried in Ruskin, Florida, in a small cemetery where the grass grows thick and the air smells of salt and cut flowers. It was a private service, family only, the kind of gathering where people drive long distances and stand in the heat and say very little because there is nothing left to say. 2 men attended that funeral who nobody could identify. They wore disguises according to the family. Hats pulled low, dark glasses. They did not speak to many people. They stood at the edges of things, the way people stand when they are not sure they should be there at all. And then they were gone, before anyone thought to ask who they were, before anyone thought to look too long. The family believed it was John and Clarence coming home one last time to say goodbye to their mother, taking the greatest risk they had taken since the night they slipped into the black water of San Francisco Bay. The FBI investigated this story. They took it seriously enough to look. They They interviewed family members. They tried to find the men in the hats and the dark glasses. They found nothing that confirmed it, but they found nothing that ruled it out either. And that is the thing about the believers. They are not asking you to take a leap. They are asking you to look at what is actually there. The photograph with no name, the funeral with the strangers, the letter that arrived in 2013, written in a hand that matched what the FBI's own analysts could not dismiss. These are not feelings. These are objects. These are events. They happened. Ken Anglin said once that he did not need the world to believe him. He needed to be honest about what he knew. He needed to say it plainly and let it stand there. Because the alternative was to agree that his uncles were bones on the floor of the bay, and he had never seen anything that made him believe that. Not once. Not in all the years of looking. There is a kind of faith that has nothing to do with religion. It is the faith you have in a person you know. The faith that says, I have seen what this person can do. I have seen how they think. And I do not believe the story you are telling me ends the way you say it does. The Anglin family carried that faith for decades. Through the silence, through the official versions, through the careful smiles of people who thought they were fooling themselves. They were not fooling themselves. They were paying attention. Now pull back from the Anglin family for a moment. Pull back from the letters and the photographs and the decades of quiet searching. Pull all the way back until the story is not about a family anymore, until it is about a place. There is a small town in the interior of Brazil called Rio Verde. It sits in the state of Goiás, far from the coast, far from the ocean that once separated 3 men from freedom. The land around it is flat and wide and golden in the dry season. Red dirt roads cut through fields of soy and sugarcane. The sky there is enormous. It presses down on everything like a warm hand. At night, the stars come out so thick and bright they look like salt scattered on dark cloth. It is not the kind of place you think about when you think about Alcatraz. It is not the kind of place that belongs in this story at all. And yet, John Anglin and Clarence Anglin grew up in a family of migrant workers. They followed the harvests. They knew how to live in open country. They knew how to disappear into the rhythm of farm work, how to become just another pair of hands in a field, how to be present without being noticed. That was not a skill they learned in prison. They brought it in with them. When investigators and researchers began following the thread of the 2013 letter, some of them ended up in Brazil. Not because someone told them to go there, because the letter itself pointed that way. It mentioned that one of the brothers was in poor health. It mentioned a doctor. It mentioned a life that had been lived quietly in a warm place, far from everything that came before. Brazil had been a destination for American fugitives before. The country had no extradition treaty with the United States for many years. People who needed to vanish knew that. It was not a secret. It was a door that stood open for a long time, and some people walked through it. The Anglin family had connections to Florida. They had worked the citrus groves, the strawberry fields, the low, flat farmland that stretches along the Gulf Coast. From Florida, the distance to South America is not as vast as it sounds. The water connects things. The water has always connected things. Researchers who traveled to the Goiás region came back with something strange. They found people who remembered two American men who had lived quietly in the area for years, men who spoke little Portuguese but worked hard and kept to themselves, men who paid in cash and asked few questions and answered fewer, men who, when pressed, said they were from the southern United States, men who smiled when asked where exactly. Nobody could prove those men were the Anglins. Nobody had a photograph. Nobody had a name that matched. But the description held a particular shape. Two brothers, close in age, one taller than the other, both with the kind of hands that had done hard work for a long time, both with a way of watching a room that people noticed without being able to say why. The land around Rio Verde is the kind of land that keeps secrets well. It is not dramatic. It does not have cliffs or caves or dark forests. It is just wide and open and ordinary. The kind of place where a person can live for 20 years and be known only as the quiet American who tends his garden and pays his bills and never causes trouble. There is something about that image that feels right, not because it is proven, because it fits the shape of who these men were. They were not men who wanted fame. They were not men who wanted to be remembered. They were men who wanted to be left alone. Men who had spent years in a place that gave them no privacy, no silence, no sky. Men who, if they made it out, would have wanted nothing more than open land and warm air, and the sound of nothing in particular. The land in Brazil does not remember them the way the bay remembers the night they left. The bay holds cold and dark, and the memory of a desperate crossing. The land in Goiás holds something quieter. The memory of two men who sat on a porch in the evening and watched the sun go down over flat fields and did not say much, who breathed the warm air, who were, for the first time in a long time, simply somewhere, simply alive, simply free. You cannot prove that happened, but you cannot prove it did not. There is a man named Robert Widner. He told his story once to a reporter in a small town in Oregon, sometime in the late 1980s. He was old by then. His hands shook a little when he held his coffee cup. He had the kind of face that had seen weather deep lines, pale eyes, a jaw that had been clenched for decades. He said he had been a fisherman on the bay in 1962. He said he had been out on the water the night of June 11th. He said he saw something. He described a shape in the water, low and dark, moving against the current. He thought at first it was a seal. Then he thought it was debris. Then it moved in a way that debris does not move. It moved with purpose. It moved like something that knew where it was going. He watched it for a moment. Then he looked away. He said he did not want to know. He said that some things on the water at night are better left alone. He went back to his nets. He did not report it. He did not tell anyone for nearly 30 years. When he finally did talk, most people did not believe him. The reporter who wrote the story buried it on page 7. The FBI never followed up. Widner died a few years later, and the story went with him into the quiet. But it stayed in the record. A small, strange note at the edge of a larger mystery. And here is the thing about that. Stories like Widner's are not rare in America. This country is full of people who saw something they were not supposed to see, who kept quiet about it for years, who finally told someone once near the end of their lives, when the weight of the secret became heavier than the fear of being laughed at. These stories surface in small papers, in letters to editors, in conversations at diners and barbershops, and feed stores in towns you have never heard of. They follow a pattern, a witness, a long silence, a late confession, and then nothing. No follow-up, no investigation. Just the story floating there, unattached to anything official. You can find the same shape in other famous disappearances. In 1930, a bush pilot named Joe Labelle stumbled onto an Inuit village in Canada where every person had vanished. Fires still burning, food still cooking, no bodies, no tracks leading out. People in the nearest town said they had seen figures moving through the tree line weeks before. They had not said anything. They had looked away, the way Widner looked away from the shape in the water. Because sometimes the mind decides on its own that it is better not to know. In 1971, a man named D.B. Cooper jumped from a plane over the Pacific Northwest with $200,000 strapped to his body. He was never found, but over the years, dozens of people came forward. A bartender in Portland who said a quiet man paid for his drinks with old bills and never gave a name. A motel clerk in Washington who remembered a guest who checked in with wet clothes and checked out before dawn. A forest ranger who found a campsite that looked like someone had stayed there for weeks, eating well, leaving no trace. None of these accounts were ever confirmed. None of them were ever fully dismissed. The pattern is the same. The witness, the silence, the slow leak of memory years later. America is a big country. It has long coastlines and deep forests and wide plains and mountain ranges that go on for days. It has always had room for people who needed to disappear. The frontier made that possible for centuries. And even now, when the country feels mapped and measured and watched, there are still places where a person can simply stop being who they were. The men who left Alcatraz understood that. If they made it out of the water, they understood it better than almost anyone alive. They had studied disappearance the way other men study a trade. They had practiced it. They had built it out of spoons and cardboard and stolen moments in a prison workshop. They knew that the best way to vanish is not to run. It is to become ordinary, to become the neighbor who waves from the porch, the man at the end of the bar who nurses one drink and leaves a fair tip, the face that is familiar enough that nobody looks twice. Widner saw something in the water. He looked away. Maybe that was the right instinct. Maybe some things are meant to pass through the dark and come out the other side unseen into whatever life is waiting for them. But becoming ordinary leaves traces. That is the strange thing about disappearing. You can change your name and your city and the way you cut your hair. You can grow a beard or lose one. You can pick up an accent or let one fade. But life requires objects. Life requires paper. And paper has a way of surviving longer than the people who made it. There are things connected to this story that you can hold in your hand. Things that sit in filing cabinets and shoeboxes and the back rooms of small historical societies. Things that do not prove anything on their own. But when you lay them side by side, they start to form a shape. And the shape is interesting. Start with the photographs. In 1975, a woman named Carol Anglin, sister to one of the 3 men who vanished from Alcatraz, received a photograph in the mail. No return address. The postmark was smudged beyond reading. Inside was a single image. 2 men standing in front of what appears to be a roadside diner somewhere in the American Southwest. Red rock formations rise in the background, pale orange and dusty in the afternoon light. The men are squinting against the sun. They are wearing plain work shirts. They look relaxed. They look like nobody. Carol said one of them looked like her brother John. The jaw, the way he held his shoulders. She kept the photograph for years. She showed it to people she trusted. Some of them agreed with her. Some of them said grief does strange things to the eye. The FBI looked at it and said it was inconclusive. They filed it and moved on. The photograph still exists. Nobody has explained who sent it or why. Then there are the letters. Over the decades following the escape, the Anglin family received a handful of unsigned notes. Some were short. Some were longer. The handwriting changed across the years, the way handwriting does when a person ages. but certain phrases repeated. Certain small details appeared that only someone close to the family would know. A nickname, a memory from a childhood summer in Georgia, the name of a dog that had been dead since the 1950s. Handwriting analysts who examined the letters gave mixed opinions. Some said the letters were consistent with samples of John Anglin's known writing. Others said the differences were too great. Nobody could agree. The letters were passed around, studied, argued over, and ultimately set aside without a verdict. But here is the thing about those letters. Someone wrote them. Someone knew those details. Someone took the time across 30 or 40 years to reach out to a family in a careful, quiet way. That is not the behavior of a hoax. A hoax burns bright and fast. This was something slower, something more careful, something that felt to the people who received those letters like a hand reaching through a wall. There were other objects too. A life preserver ring washed up on Angel Island in the weeks after the escape. It was not from Alcatraz. The markings did not match any vessel reported in the bay that night. Nobody ever claimed it. It sat in a storage room for years before a researcher found it while looking for something else entirely. A wallet turned up in a pawn shop in Reno, Nevada, sometime in the late 1960s. Inside was a library card with a name that did not match any known person in the state. The address on the card led to a vacant lot. The pawn shop owner remembered the man who sold it as quiet and polite, medium height, with a southern accent. He said the man seemed in no particular hurry. He took the money, folded it into his shirt pocket, and walked out into the afternoon like he had nowhere special to be. None of these things, taken alone, mean very much. A photograph can be misread. Letters can be forged. A wallet can belong to anyone. A life preserver ring can drift a long way from where it started. But the accumulation of them is harder to dismiss. Each one is a small crack in the official story. And when you have enough small cracks, the wall starts to look different. It starts to look less like a solid thing and more like something held together by habit and assumption and the simple human preference for a clean ending. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers did not give anyone a clean ending. left behind a trail of small, stubborn objects, things that refuse to line up the way they should, things that sit quietly in boxes and wait for someone to pick them up and ask the right question. The objects are still there. The question is still open. Stories travel differently than facts do. Facts get written down, filed away, locked in cabinets. Stories get passed across dinner tables. They get whispered at funerals. They get told to grandchildren who are half asleep on the couch, and those grandchildren carry them forward without even knowing they're doing it. The families of John and Clarence Anglin have been carrying this story for more than 60 years now. They grew up in a small farming community in Georgia. The Anglins did. A big, sprawling family. Lots of brothers and sisters. Lots of cousins. The kind of family that fills a church and spills out onto the lawn. And when John and Clarence went to Alcatraz, the family didn't disappear. They stayed. They kept in touch. They wrote letters. They visited when they could. And when June of 1962 came, and the news broke that the brothers had escaped into the bay, the family did what families do. They waited. They hoped. They watched the mailbox. Some of them say the mailbox didn't disappoint. This is where the story gets soft at the edges, the way old photographs do. The details shift depending on who's telling it, but the shape of the story stays the same. Cards arrived. Christmas cards, some say. Sent from somewhere with no return address. The handwriting looked right. The words sounded like the brothers. Small things, private things, references to shared memories that a stranger couldn't have known. The family didn't go to the FBI with these cards. You can understand why. The brothers were fugitives. Turning over evidence of their survival would have meant turning them in. So the cards were kept quiet, passed around in private, held close. One of the sisters, Marie Anglin Widner, spoke about this more than once before she passed. She said she believed her brothers were alive for years after the escape. She didn't say it like someone grasping at hope. She said it the way you say something you simply know. Calm and certain. The way you'd say the sun came up this morning. She said the family received word. Not through official channels, not through lawyers or lawmen, through the quiet routes that families use when they need to to stay invisible. A message passed through a friend of a friend. A phone call that lasted less than a minute. A face glimpsed at a distance during a family funeral. Standing just outside the tree line. Gone before anyone could be sure. That last detail is the one that stays with you. The funeral story. The Anglin family has told it in different forms over the years. Their mother's funeral. A graveside service on a warm southern afternoon. And there, at the edge of the cemetery, two figures standing among the trees, older than anyone remembered them. Heavier, maybe, wearing hats pulled low. They didn't come close. They didn't speak to anyone, but the family members who saw them said they knew. The way you know your own blood. Something in the posture. Something in the way they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, the way brothers do. They were gone before the service ended. Now, you can hear that story and call it grief. You can say that people in mourning see what they want to see. That's a fair thing to say. Grief does strange things to the eyes, but the family has held this story for decades without flinching. They've told it to journalists and documentarians and federal investigators. They've told it at kitchen tables with the coffee going cold. And the story doesn't change the way invented stories do. It stays the same. Same afternoon. Same trees. Same two figures. The names they may have borrowed, the new identities they may have worn like borrowed coats, those names are lost to time now. Maybe they were common names. Smith, Johnson, something that would slide past without catching on anything. Names chosen for their plainness. Names that would let a man stand in a hardware store or a diner or a bus station and be nobody in particular. That's the art of disappearing, really. You don't become someone dramatic. You become someone forgettable. You become the medium-height man with the southern accent who takes his change and walks out into the afternoon. You become the figure at the tree line who is gone before anyone can be certain. The Anglin family kept their silence for a long time. They protected the story the way you protect something fragile. Carefully, with both hands. But stories want to be told. They find their way out eventually. They always do. And this one has been finding its way out, piece by piece, for more than 60 years now. Patient as water, quiet as fog, moving forward in its own time. The U.S. Marshals Service has been looking for Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers since June of 1962. That is not a rumor. That is a fact they will tell you themselves. The case is still open, still active. After more than 60 years, someone in an office somewhere is still, technically, looking. That detail alone should give you pause. Most cases go cold. Most cases get filed away in a box in a room nobody visits. The paperwork yellows. The names fade. But this one stayed open. This one kept its file. And the marshals who have worked it over the decades, the ones who inherited it from the ones before them, they tend to say the same careful things when reporters call. They say the men are presumed dead. They say there is no credible evidence of survival. They say the investigation is ongoing. Notice what they do not say. They do not say the men are dead. They say presumed. That word is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It is a word chosen by people who know the difference between a fact and an assumption. It is the word you use when you want to leave a door open, just a crack. There are marshals who have worked this case for years and come away with something they did not expect. Not certainty, not proof, something quieter than that. A feeling, maybe. A sense that the story they were handed did not quite match the shape of the evidence they found. One retired marshal, speaking to a documentary crew years ago, said something that stuck. He said the case had a quality he could not name, like a room where the furniture had been moved. Everything was there, but nothing was quite where it should be. That is not the language of a man who believes 3 bodies dissolved in the bay. That is the language of a man who kept looking, because looking still felt like it meant something. The marshals are not the only ones who know things they will not say out loud. The FBI held this case for decades before passing it to the Marshals in 1979. 17 years of federal investigation. 17 years of field agents and informants and paper trails and dead ends. When they handed it off, they handed off thousands of pages. Photographs, interviews, lab reports. Most of that material has never been made public. Some of it has been released through records requests, but with sections blacked out. Whole paragraphs gone, names removed, destinations redacted. You can look at those pages and wonder what was worth hiding. Maybe nothing. Maybe it is just the ordinary caution of a bureaucracy protecting its sources. Or maybe somewhere in those blacked out lines is a name that matched a name somewhere else. A face that matched a face. A thread that, if pulled, would have changed the story entirely. The truth is that institutions protect themselves. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how institutions work. If the FBI spent 17 years and significant resources hunting 3 men and never found them, that is an embarrassing outcome. It is much tidier to close the chapter with a presumption of drowning. It is much cleaner to let the bay have them. The alternative, that 3 convicted felons built a raft out of raincoats and paddled away from the most secure prison in America and were never seen again, that alternative reflects poorly on a lot of people. So the official story serves a purpose. It always has. But the Marshals kept the case open anyway. Someone kept paying attention. Someone kept the file from going into the box in the room nobody visits. And that quiet persistence, that refusal to fully close the door, says something. It says that somewhere in the machinery of the law, someone was not entirely convinced. There is a kind of knowing that lives below the level of proof. It is not evidence. It cannot be entered into a court record. But it is real. It shapes decisions. It keeps files open. It makes a retired agent choose a careful word like presumed instead of a simple word like dead. The Marshals know something. Maybe not everything. Maybe not enough to act on. But something in the shape of this case. Something in the way the evidence arranged itself left a mark on the people who spent years inside it. You can hear it in the careful language. You can feel it in the open file. They are still looking. After 60 years, they are still looking. And the simplest explanation for that is also the most interesting one. They are still looking because they are not entirely sure what they would find. Stand still for a moment. Just breathe. Picture yourself on the shore of San Francisco Bay on a night in June. The water is black and wide in front of you. The city glows behind the hills like a banked fire, orange and amber, soft at the edges. The fog has come in low. It sits on the surface of the bay like a wool blanket pulled up to the chin of something sleeping. The air smells of salt and cold iron and something faintly green, like seaweed drying on stone. You can hear the water. It moves against the rocks in long, slow pulls, not violent, patient, the way water always sounds when it has been doing something for a very long time and has no reason to hurry. Out there in the dark, maybe 1.5 miles, maybe 2, you can just make out the shape of the island. Alcatraz sits low and dark against the sky. Its old lighthouse still turns. The beam sweeps out in a slow circle, white and clean, cutting through the fog and then disappearing into it. The light comes around again and again, steady as a heartbeat. This is the place where it almost cracked open more than once. There was a night in the late 1990s when a retired FBI agent sat in a bar in San Francisco and told a journalist something he had never said on the record. He said the case never felt finished. He said that in all his years of work, the Alcatraz escape was the one file he thought about when he could not sleep. He did not say they were alive. He was too careful for that. But he said the water that night was not what they told the public it was. He said the currents ran different. He said someone had done the math wrong or chosen to do it wrong, and he had never been able to decide which. The journalist wrote it down. The story never ran. The editor said there was nothing new to print. The retired agent went home. The night kept its secret. There was another night, sometime in the 1970s, when a U.S. Marshal in the Pacific Northwest received a tip. A man fitting the description of one of the brothers had been seen working on a fishing boat out of a small harbor town. The marshal drove out. He asked around. He found the harbor. He found the boat. The man was gone. Someone at the dock said he had left 2 days before. No forwarding address. No last name anyone could remember. Just a quiet man who kept to himself and knew the water well. The marshal filed his report. The file stayed open. The harbor town went back to sleep. There was a night in 1993 when a woman in a small California town found a box of old photographs in her late mother's closet. Her mother had worked as a nurse in a clinic near the Oregon border in the 1960s. One of the photographs showed 3 men standing outside the clinic. The woman did not know who they were. She almost threw the box away. Then she saw the date written on the back in her mother's handwriting. June 1963. 1 year after the escape, she sent the photograph to a newspaper. The newspaper sent it to the FBI. The FBI said the image was too poor to identify anyone. The photograph disappeared into a file. The woman never heard back. Each of these nights had the same shape. A door opened just a crack. Light came through. Then the door swung shut again. Not slammed, just closed, quietly. The way doors close when no one is in a hurry to make noise. The bay does not care about any of this. It moves the same way it always has. The fog rolls in from the Pacific and settles over the water and makes the world feel smaller and closer and softer. The lighthouse beam keeps turning. The rocks along the shore are dark and wet and cold to the touch. Standing here now in the dark, with the water pulling at the stones in front of you, it is easy to understand why this case never let go of the people inside it. There is something about this place, something about the way the island sits out there in the middle of all that black water, silent and patient, keeping whatever it knows to itself. The night is very quiet. The fog is very thick. And somewhere out beyond the reach of the lighthouse beam, the bay goes on, dark and deep, and full of things it has never once been asked to give back. Then in 2013, something arrived in the mail. The U.S. Marshals Service received a letter. It was handwritten. The paper was old. The handwriting was shaky in the way that hands get shaky when they have lived a long time and done a great deal of work. Whoever wrote it had pressed hard with the pen, like they wanted the words to stay. The letter claimed to be from John Anglin. It said he was alive. It said he was 83 years old and sick. It said that Frank Morris and Clarence Anglin had both died, Frank in 1976 and Clarence in 2011. It said all 3 of them had made it across the bay that night in June of 1962. It said they had lived. It said the writer wanted medical treatment in exchange for coming forward. And it said, in plain and simple words, that if the government agreed, he would turn himself in. The Marshals sat on that letter for 4 years. They did not release it to the public until 2018. By then, if the letter was real, John Anglin would have been 88 years old. The window the letter had offered was already closed. Handwriting analysts looked at it. They compared it to old samples of John Anglin's writing from his prison files. The results were not clean. They were not a perfect match, but they were not a clear rejection either. The analysts said the handwriting was consistent with someone who had aged significantly. Hands change. Grip changes. The way a person forms letters shifts over decades. The way a river slowly shifts its course without anyone noticing until the map is wrong. The FBI ran the letter through every test they had. They pulled DNA from the envelope flap. They found a partial DNA profile. It was not enough to confirm anything. It was not enough to rule anything out. The letter sat in that strange middle place where so much of this story has always lived, not proven, not disproven, just present. And that is where the legacy of this story truly lives. Not in the courtrooms, not in the official files, not in the cold language of federal reports. The legacy lives in the fact that a letter like that could arrive 50 years after 3 men vanished into black water, and the people reading it could not say with certainty that it was fake. That is the thing. That is what this story left behind. A permanent uncertainty. A door that cannot be fully closed because no one has ever found the key. The people who have spent years studying this case, the researchers, the family members, the retired investigators who kept their notes long after they were supposed to stop. All of them say the same thing in different ways. They say the letter felt real, not because of the handwriting, not because of the DNA, but because of the details inside it. Small things. Things that matched facts that were not public. Things a person would only know if they had been there. Whether that means anything is something each person has to decide for themselves. What the letter did, more than anything else, was remind people that this story is not finished. It never quietly resolved itself way cold cases sometimes do, where the years pile up and the people involved pass on, and the mystery just fades into the background of history. This one did not fade. It kept sending signals. A photograph here, a letter there, a relative who remembered something a dying man said. The story kept reaching back toward the living. There is a particular kind of legend that does this. It stays warm. It does not go cold the way other unsolved things do. It keeps a low heat, like coals under ash. And every few years, something stirs it, and the glow comes back, and people lean in close again. The 1962 Alcatraz Escape is that kind of story. It became part of how Americans think about what is possible, about what a person can do with enough patience and enough will and enough time, about whether the systems we build to hold people are ever truly as solid as we believe them to be, about what it means to disappear, and whether disappearing is always a tragedy, or whether sometimes it is something else entirely. The old man's handwriting, shaky and pressed hard into old paper, asked a simple question. It asked whether anyone was still listening. The answer, it turns out, was yes. The answer has always been yes. The bay keeps moving. The fog keeps coming in. And the letter sits in a file somewhere, still waiting to be fully understood. There is a woman named Carol who grew up in Marin County, just across the water from the island. She could see Alcatraz from her bedroom window when she was small. On clear mornings, it sat out there in the bay like a gray stone dropped by a careless hand. She watched it the way children watch things they cannot name, with a kind of quiet fascination, with the sense that the thing is watching back. Her father worked the docks. He knew men who had known men who were on the water that June night in 1962. Not guards, not federal agents, just men who worked the bay and heard things, and kept those things folded up inside them the way you fold a letter you never send. Her father passed those stories to Carol the way you pass a candle in the dark, carefully, with both hands. When Carol was 23, she moved to Portland, then to Boise, then to a small town in eastern Montana, where the sky is so wide it feels like a second ocean above your head. She brought the story with her every time. It traveled in her the way a a song travels. You don't carry it on purpose. It just comes along. In Montana, she told it to her neighbors, to the man who fixed her furnace, to the woman who ran the diner 2 blocks from her apartment. She told it the way her father told it to her, not as a crime story, not as a mystery to be solved, as something more like a parable, a story about 3 men who looked at something impossible and decided to try anyway. People in Montana listened. That surprised her at first. She thought it was a California story, a Bay story, a story that needed salt air and fog to make sense. But it didn't. The story worked in the high, dry cold just as well. Because the story isn't really about Alcatraz. It's about the idea that a wall is only a wall until someone decides it isn't. Carol is older now. She has grandchildren. She tells them the story the same way her father told it to her. She leaves out the cold water. She leaves out the official reports and the FBI files and the decades of silence. She tells them about 3 men with spoons and patience, and a plan so careful it took more than a year to build. She tells them that those men looked at the bay and made a decision, and then she lets the ending stay open. Because that is where the story lives, in the open ending. That is the thing about a legend that travels. It changes shape to fit the place it lands. In Marin County, it is a ghost story told with the island in plain sight. In Montana, it is something closer to a folk tale about will and endurance. In other places, it becomes something else again, a story about the government and what it hides, a story about family and what brothers owe each other, a story about the ocean and what it keeps. But underneath all those different shapes, the same thing is always there. 3 men went into the water. Nobody knows for certain what happened next. And that uncertainty has a kind of warmth to it, a strange comfort, because it means the story is still alive. It means the ending hasn't been written yet. Alcatraz still stands out in the bay. You can take a ferry to it now. Tourists walk the cell blocks and take photographs and listen to recordings of what it sounded like when the place was full of men. The cells are small, smaller than you expect. The bars are cold, even in summer. The smell of damp concrete and old iron never quite leaves the place. And somewhere in those walls, in the plaster and the paint and the stone, there is still the shape of what those three men did. The holes they cut, the passage they crawled through, the roof they crossed in the dark, the water they entered. The island holds all of that. It keeps it the way old places keep things, quietly, without being asked. Carol still thinks about the view from her childhood window sometimes. The island sitting in the gray morning water, the fog coming in from the Pacific in long, slow waves. She thinks about her father's voice telling her the story for the first time. The way he leaned in close. The way he said it like it mattered. It did matter. It still does. The story found her. She carried it across half the country. And now it keeps going, passed from one set of hands to the next, moving outward from the bay like rings on still water. The water keeps the best secrets. That is the thing about the bay. It is not cruel. It is not kind. It is simply old and deep and patient in a way that human beings cannot quite be. The tides move in and out on their own schedule. The fog comes and goes without asking anyone's permission. The current runs beneath the surface, the way time runs beneath everything steady, invisible, indifferent to what we want from it. Frank Morris went into that water. John Anglin went in. Clarence Anglin went in. That much is certain. 3 men crossed a roof in the dark, slid down a pipe, and entered the bay on a raft made from raincoats and rubber cement and sheer human will. That part of the story belongs to the record. It is written down. It is agreed upon. What happened next belongs to the water, and the water has never said a word. People have tried to read it, of course. Scientists have run the currents through their models and come up with different answers on different days. Some say the math works. Some say it doesn't. Some say a man could make it across that stretch of cold, dark bay on a night like that one. Some say no man could. The water doesn't argue with any of them. It just keeps moving, the way it always has, carrying whatever it carries out toward the open Pacific and the long blue nothing beyond. Here is what stays with you when you sit with this story long enough. 3 men built a way out of a place that was not supposed to have one. They did it slowly quietly over months with tools that weren't tools and materials that weren't materials. They made dummy heads from soap and paint and human hair and laid them in their beds like sleeping children. They crawled through a passage. They carved themselves, inch by inch, in the dark, while the guards walked their rounds above. They crossed a rooftop under the stars. They launched themselves into the coldest, most dangerous water on the California coast. And then the record ends. There is no body. There is no grave. There is no confirmed sighting. No fingerprint. No DNA. No photograph clear enough to close the case. There is a letter that arrived decades late in handwriting that looked right. There is a photograph from Brazil that made people stop and stare. There is a brother who spent his whole life looking and never stopped believing. There are marshals who kept the file open long past the point when most people would have let it go. There is the water, and the water gives nothing back. What the story offers instead is something rarer than an answer. It offers a question that stays warm in your hands. A question you can turn over and look at from different angles and never quite put down. It is the kind of question that follows you out of the room, that rides home with you in the car, that sits at the edge of your thoughts on a quiet evening when the light is going gold and the world feels both very large and very small. Did they make it? That is the question. 3 words, no answer. Just the open door of it, standing there in the fog. Maybe Frank Morris lived a long and ordinary life somewhere far from here. Maybe he grew old in a small house with a view of something green. Maybe he sat on a porch in the evening and listened to the birds and thought about the night he crossed the bay and never told a single soul. Maybe he is buried under a name that isn't his, in a town that never knew what it had. Maybe the water took all 3 of them. Maybe the current one. Maybe the cold was too much and the dark was too deep, and the story ended in the bay on the night it began. You will not know. Nobody alive will know for certain. The case is technically still open, which means the government has not decided either. The Marshals have not closed the door. They have left it exactly where it is, slightly ajar, letting in a thin line of light. The bay sits out there right now, in the dark, moving the way it always moves. The island rises from it like a gray stone fist. The fog comes in from the Pacific in long, slow waves, the way Carol's father described it, the way his father might have described it before him. The water knows. The water is not telling. And somehow, that is enough to keep the story alive for one more night. And now the story is told, or as told as it will ever be, which is not the same thing as finished. These things are never finished. They breathe. They move from mouth to mouth, the way fog moves across the bay, slow and quiet and impossible to hold. You are here in the dark, and the fire is low. The embers are orange and soft. The night has settled around you the way nights do when a story has run its course, heavy and warm and still. This is the hour when the world outside goes quiet and the mind starts to wander toward sleep. Let it. There is nothing left to solve tonight. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers went into the water on the night of June 11th, 1962. That part is not in question. What happened after is the part that belongs to the dark, the part that belongs to stories like this one, told in low voices, told to people who are almost asleep, told because some things are too strange and too beautiful to let go of. Here is what you can hold on to if you want something solid. 3 men built a raft from raincoats. They carved a hole through a concrete wall with a spoon. They made dummy heads from soap and hair and set them in their beds like sleeping children. They climbed through a ventilation shaft in the middle of the night, and they went up to the roof, and they looked out at the bay, and they jumped. Whatever came after that, they did all of that. Nobody can take that away from them. The island is still out there. Right now, as you listen to this, Alcatraz sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay, dark and heavy, ringed by cold water. The old cell house stands the way it always stood, its walls pale in the moonlight, its windows empty. The gulls have gone quiet for the night. The fog is coming in from the Pacific, the way it always comes, slow and white and soft as breath. If you stood on the shore in Marin County right now and looked south across the water, you would see the island as a dark shape against a darker sky. You would hear the bay moving. You would feel the cold coming off the water, that particular cold that has no bottom to it, that goes all the way down. And somewhere in that cold, or somewhere beyond it, the story is still moving. Maybe Frank Morris lived a long, quiet life. Maybe he sat on a porch somewhere and watched the sun go down and felt the particular piece of a man who got away with something the whole world said was impossible. Maybe the Anglins grew old in a country that did not know their names. Maybe they fished. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they thought about that night the way you think about a dream, vivid and strange and already fading. Or maybe the water took them. Maybe the current was too strong and the cold was too deep, and the story ended before it had a chance to begin. Maybe the bay holds them still, the way it holds everything it takes, quietly and without apology. You do not have to decide. That is the gift of a story like this one. You get to hold both possibilities at once. You get to live in the space between what is known and what is not. And that space is not frightening. It is wide and soft and full of room. The mystery does not need to be solved to be beautiful. The not knowing is part of it. The open case file, the letter with the old man's handwriting, the photograph nobody could explain, the brother who kept looking until he could not look anymore. All of it lives in that space. All of it breathes there. The fire is almost out now, just a glow, just warmth. The island sits in the bay. The fog moves across the water. 3 names are written in a file that is technically still open, which means officially, even now, the story has not ended. The door is still ajar. The thin line of light is still there. And somewhere out in the American dark, in a town nobody thinks to look at twice, in a cemetery under a borrowed name, or in a life so quiet it left no mark at all, the answer is resting, patient still. It has been resting for 60 years. It can rest a little longer. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.